Good day, ma'am. I am Sophia Mendoza, and today I will be presenting the Summer Solstice of Nicwakin, which is part of the literature under the Republic. So first, let me introduce Nicomedes Onching M. Joaquin, or most commonly known as Nicwakin. He was born on May 4th, 1917 in Paco, Manila, and during the time he was studying, he found that he could study more by reading books from his father instead of sitting inside a classroom conforming to the curriculum, and so he dropped out of high school at his third year. He tried out several jobs to earn a living, and at 17, he published his first poem about Don Quixote, and at 20, he published his first short story, The Sorrows of Vaudeville. As he was beginning his journey as a writer, the Second World War came, which made him feel so fearful of the everyday danger he could possibly come across. Nonetheless, this was the time when he produced some of his best works, including The Summer Solstice. He was conferred with the National Artist for Literature Award in 1976, which he almost refused to receive, but eventually he accepted it to free his close friend, Jose F. Lacaba, who was imprisoned. When he published his essay La Naval de Manila in 1943, the Dominican monastery in Hong Kong, which is St. Albert's College, was impressed, so much so that he was offered a scholarship to become a priest, and later on, the University of Santo Tomas awarded him with the UST Honorary Associate in Arts. He came back after 2 years with a made-up mind that he wanted to pursue literary writing more than priesthood. He then expressed his gratitude to USD by donating thousands of his books to the library, not to be showcased in the museum, but to be placed in the library to be used by the students. There is a section in the library specially dedicated to his works, which is named Esquinita de Quijano de Manila. He used Quijano de Manila as a journalist, Quijano being an anagram of his name, Joaquin. During his stay in the Philippine Free Press as a proofreader, staff writer, film reviewer, and literary editor, he was deemed as an important journalist during his time because of his several contributions in the Philippine journalism. He was one of the journalists who advocated for writers to have a regular section in the newspapers and magazines. Being under the regime of Marcos, journalists were a threat to the government, and so the Philippine Free Press was not an exemption from red tagging. When this happened, Nick Joaquin and his peers started Asia Philippines Leader, and he worked as its first editor-in-chief. Even when the government was persistent in controlling the media and journalists, he was motivated to publish his journalistic writings in 1977. He published several works such as Nora Honor and Other Profiles, Ronnie Poe and Other Silhouettes, Reportage on Lovers, Reportage on Crime, and more. On the other hand, he was Nick Joaquin when he wrote creatively. And the irony of it all, when the injustices and corrupt systems and the government was rampant during the 1970s, Joaquin was creative and innovative as ever, producing literary works such as plays, short stories, poetries, and translating Spanish works into English. Nick Joaquin was unstoppable when he was writing. He was as important as a creative writer as he is as a journalist for the same reason of having contributed a lot to the Philippine literature. He contributed poetry and fiction to metropolitan magazines, and while he was a journalist, he did not stop exploring the world of literature by experimenting with different forms and techniques in writing fiction, poetry, drama, and nonfiction. Speaking of which, he was a contributor in the growth of creative nonfiction during the years of 1979 to 2000s, when he wrote dozens of biographies of politicians, artists, and businessmen. When he returned to writing poetry, El Camino Real and Other Rhymes was produced in 1983, and Collected Verse was published in 1987, initiating developments in poetry in the country. Though he was somehow criticized for writing in English, his nationalism did not falter. He argued that the English language had played a big role in the Filipino literature. Whether he wrote in the vernacular or foreign language, his passion and love for his nationality is not to be questioned. In connection to his nationalism, when he was conferred the National Artist for Literature Award in 1976, and having his works described as beacons in racial landscape and himself being commended for his rare excellence and significant contribution to literature, this did not blind him to be critical of the government. He was not seen on the streets holding a placard or a megaphone, but instead he bled his opposition, criticisms, and resistance through paper. Whether he was a journalist or a creative writer, his works revolved around the transition of the country from colonial rule to post-colonial era, search for Filipinos' national and cultural identity, fight for freedom and equality, fight against oppression and corruption, and finally, optimism and finding hope for the Philippines. And for that, Nick Joaquin is rightfully to be identified as a significant writer and a great contributor in the Philippine journalism and literature. Listed on the screen are some of his works and awards. For the milieu, Joaquin published The Summer Solstice in 1972, a time when the Philippines was still under the influence of the American culture. From 1946 to 1960, Americans were in control of the economy, politics, military, and culture of the Filipinos were also determined by the Americans. Also at a time when the Educational Exchange Program or Fulbright program was implemented and Filipinos were granted to study in the US to learn about their culture. It was supposedly an exchange of cultures, however, it only became a one-way cultural traffic, according to Lambera. This further immersed the Filipinos in the culture of the colonizers, resulting in the struggle of finding national and cultural identity. The summer solstice is a time when the sun is at its highest point, and during this time, Tadtarin is celebrated by women who perform rituals of fertility around the balete tree. The Tadtarin is observed at the same time when St. John's Festival is celebrated by men. The story opens with the intense heat waking up Doña Lupeng Moreta. As she goes to the kitchen, she finds that it was the children's nurse who is preparing the breakfast, not Amada, who is the cook of the Moretas. Doña Lupeng found out through Entoy, Amada's husband, that she participated in the Tadarin last night and she now thinks that she is the Tadarin herself. Doña Lupeng was in disbelief. Guido comes home to the Philippines after being in Europe as a student, and as the family celebrates the festival of St. John, Guido reveals that he also participated in the Tadarin. He expressed his adoration for these festivals, describing them as romantic. He also explains the beauty and mystical nature of Tadarin and the supremacy of women in ancient times, which Doña Lupeng found nonsensical. Before she left, Guido expressed his adoration for Doña Lupeng by kissing her feet. Doña Lupeng's intrigue with the Tadarin grew, and she then finds herself wanting to join the last night of Tadarin and ultimately does so. Don Paeng tried to get her from the crowd of women but gets beaten. When Doña Lupeng came home from the ritual, she discovered a power over masculinity and makes her husband kiss her feet. Now we come to the analyzation of the story wherein we will dissect the setting, character, conflicts, themes, language, and its social and political implications. The general analysis is that Nick Joaquin tells a story of a woman who successfully triumphed over not only the domineering masculinity of her husband, but also the general expectations of society towards women, especially in a domestic setting, at least during the Tadarin. This triumph is specifically evident in the ending wherein the supposed dominant character becomes the recessive one. Another analysis or interpretation that we can draw from this story is the possible triumph of paganism and the primitive over Christianity and civilization, brought by the colonizers. This analysis was based on the linguistic study of Eileen O. Salonga. The setting of the story was in the 1850s during the festival of St. John, and from its title, it happened during a summer solstice. It is also a time where women are expected to submit to men. Now we talk about the characters. Doña Lopeng Moreta, aside from being a woman with 3 children and wife of Don Paeng, she is a woman that is heavily influenced by her husband's opinion, and she is close to her sexuality. Don Paeng Moreta is the husband of Doña Lopeng and is a highly respected man. He is a man who is very much in touch with his masculinity and wants to be the dominant one in his family. Guido is the younger cousin of Don Paeng who studied in Europe. He is a man who I believe does not conform to the usual masculinity that is expected of men. He adores women, including Doña Lupeng. Amada is the cook of the Moretas and the battered wife of Entoy. She participated in a Tatarin festival and a woman who is open to her sexuality. Entoy is the family driver of Moretas. He beats up his wife at first, but when her wife became a Tadarin, he becomes meek as a lamb. He foreshadowed what Don Paeng would become by the end of the story, powerless over his wife. Now we talk about the conflict, which are man versus himself, and man versus society. Man versus man, mostly between Doña Lupeng and Don Paeng, who represent masculinity and femininity, which usually come into conflict in society, but it is also observed in the relationship of Amada and Antoy. Man versus himself, Doña Lupeng initially struggles to set herself free from her husband, causing her to struggle internally and not become entitled to her own opinions and sexuality. Man versus society, there is an evident antagonistic views from both men and women towards each other. Doña Lupeng showed annoyance with the prideful men who celebrate Saint John, while Don Paeng was smiling throughout the parade. Don Paeng, on the other hand, felt insulted and outraged when the women were screaming and dancing on the streets, carrying the black image of the Baptist, and while Doña Lupeng was very much fascinated. So there are two major themes that I have observed in the story, which are first, patriarchy, with Don Paeng long stares of dismay towards Doña Lupeng when she doesn't act like a woman. His dominance is observed over his wife, which reflects the broader situation of the society. Nick Joaquin attempts to mirror what it's like to be a woman in a patriarchal world through Doña Lupeng. Second is sexuality. Written at a time when the country is very much overpowered by the conventional teachings of the church, sexuality may be seen as a controversial theme to add in a story, but Nick Joaquin was brave enough to write and shine on sexuality and how it should be normal to embrace it, especially by women who are expected to be conservative. For the language used, I believe that since the family of Moretas are one of the middle classes in the society, considering that they have their own cook and driver, the author utilized the English language to mirror their social status. And going back to the milieu when the piece was written, it must be kept in mind that during this time, foreign works of poetry, fiction, and drama were easily brought by the Americans to the libraries and universities in the Philippines, paving the way for easier access to the American language, style, ideologies, and culture. Next is the social and political implications. It is political in a way that the author wrote about the pagan celebrations, considering that Christianity was strictly taught and imposed by Spaniards on the Filipinos. This brings us to a deeper understanding of the story. It is not only about the tension between man and woman, but also the Filipinos and the colonizers, and the fight between paganism and Christianity. The colonizers came and altered the Filipino lifestyle and culture. Filipinos were once pagans, but then when the colonizers took over, we were forced to fit in their beliefs and way of living, blurring out the national and cultural identity of the Filipinos. Next is a difference between the expectations towards men and women. Women are expected to submit to their husbands, do the houseworks, act prim and proper at all times. A woman acting the opposite or resisting these social expectations are to be judged or despised, while men are considered to be the dominant creatures and therefore expected of nothing. To end, these are some excerpts from the story that stood out to me. The first one is from Doña Lupeng. Women had built it up, this poise of the male. Ah, and the women could destroy it too. And was it not the mystery of a woman in her flowers that had restored the tongue of the old Hebrew prophet? This sounds to me what she really believes in, her real perspective towards men and her power as a woman. Deep down, without her husband's input and the opinion of society towards her, she believes that men owes it to the women, their image. However, because of the influence of men over women, Doña Lupeng found these thoughts shameful, improper, and almost obscene. She thought to herself that she was being wicked when these thoughts came to her mind. Next is from Entoy. The spirit is in her. She is the Tadarin. She must do as she pleases, otherwise the grain would not bear fruit, the rivers would give no fish, and the animals would die. This shows how powerful the Tadarin is, or women are, that even the man who usually beats up his wife becomes meek as a lamb, and he could not do what he normally would because the power is not in his hands anymore, but his wife's.
Si Amanda po ang tatarin kagabi. Kaya pwede niya pong gawin maski anong gusto niya.
Kalokohan.
pigilan po siya eh. Hindi tutubo ang mga palay. Hindi magbubunga ang mga punong kahoy. Hindi mangingis na ang mga dagat. Mamamatay ang mga hayop.
Next is a conversation between Don Paeng and Doña Lupeng. That I adore you, that I adore you, that I worship you, that the air you breathe and the ground you tread is holy to me, that I am your dog, your slave. But it was still not enough. Her fists were still clenched, and she cried, "Then come, crawl on the floor and kiss my feet." In these lines, we could go back to the shameful, improper, and almost obscene thoughts that Doña Lupeng had. She thought that this poise of the male was built up by women, and that women could destroy it too, and certainly she did. The poise that Don Paeng once had, she was able to destroy it and make him kiss her feet, because she indeed did not only want to be loved and respected, but also adored.
Mahal kita, Lupe.
Anong sinabi mo?
Minamahal kita. Mahal na mahal kita. Lupe, sinasamba ko ang hangin iyong nilalanghap. Ang lupang iyong tinatapakan. Ako yung nalipin. Ako yung aso.
Lumuot ka. Gumapang ka.
Bakit mo ko ginaganito?
Gumapang ka.
This is the end of my report. Thank you very much for listening. Listed on the screen are my references.